Before I begin, I want to ask you to do something. Take a moment and try to recall something that filled you with awe. I really don't care what it was or how long ago it happened. Each of us will have our own stories. Some of us will have plenty of them to think about. I want you to think of just one time, one place when you experienced awe. And now, just to make sure you really did put that in your minds, I'm going to invite you to share that with somebody sitting near you. You may need to move closer to do that, to tell the story of what came to your mind when I asked you to remember something that brought awe to you. I'll give you a few minutes to share that. Go ahead and share in the pews with somebody near you. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to invite you now to stand in honor of the living word, whose voice can be heard in the written word, today coming to us from the 17th chapter of Matthew. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, and brought them to the top of a very high mountain. He was transformed in front of them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with Jesus. Peter reacted to all of this by saying to Jesus, "Lord, it's good that we're here. If you want, I'll make 3 shrines, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, look, a bright cloud overshadowed them. A voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I dearly love. I'm very pleased with him. Listen to him." Hearing this, the disciples fell on their faces, filled with awe. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, "Don't tell anybody about the vision until the human one is raised from the dead." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. I don't know what you thought of when I asked you to recall a time that filled you with awe. It could have been a lunar eclipse. It could have been the breathtaking view that you see when you stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon and look across. It could have been when you saw a child being born. It could have been your first kiss. These are events in our lives that sometimes give us goosebumps. We realize that something mysterious and holy is taking place. We sometimes refer to them as breathtaking events because they take our breath away. For the disciples, that happened on the mountaintop. But it wasn't when Jesus was transformed or transfigured. And it wasn't when Moses and Elijah appeared before them. It was when they heard God's voice. A voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I dearly love. I am very pleased with him. Listen to him." Hearing this, the disciples fell on their faces, filled with awe. I've been pondering that event this week and wondering and remembering all those times when I have experienced awe, when I felt goosebumps go up my back or down my arms, those times when I have found myself falling to my knees in amazement. I remember, for example, holding our grandson in my hand shortly after he was born. At the time, he was the smallest baby boy to survive birth at KU Med Center in Kansas City. He was 1 pound, 2 ounces when he was born. It was amazing to hold this child in my hand, one hand, this fragile life. Going back further, I remembered the time when we said goodbye to our first foster children, Daniel and Pauletta. Pauletta especially had been worried that her mother didn't know where they were, and so we encouraged her by telling her that it was okay, that her mother was holding them in her heart. When they left our home 9 days later, Pauletta asked if we would hold her in our hearts. I practiced saying that, and I still can't without tears and goosebumps. That was in 1990, and I still hold her in my heart. Further back in my memory, I remember the time I was on a submarine. And you may not know this, but when a submarine comes up to periscope depth, the waves sometimes make it very difficult to control the ship. And so you want to go a little faster so you have control over it, or have calm water. But if you do that, the periscope might make a wake, and the wake is visible by radar, if not by eyes. And we were in a place where we didn't want to be noticed. And so the captain asked me to pray a weather prayer, kind of like General Patton used to do before battle. When we came to periscope depth later that day, it was amazing. The swells were minimal, making it easy to maneuver at slow speeds. There was a wind that was making the surface of the water choppy so that a wake wouldn't be noticed. And it was snowing, making it hard for eyes to see us. It could not have been more perfect. And I found chills going up my spine when I realized how God was able to answer a prayer. Then there was the time when I was visiting a church and I was the only one in the sanctuary when I walked in, and something about that space, that empty space, made me so aware of God's presence that I was in awe. I remember the time that I went backpacking and I went up to the ridge of a mountain and watched the sunset. I didn't watch it, but I did hear about people who were watching on the internet very closely this week as a baby giraffe was being born. What all those moments have in common is that they fill us with awe. And I know you can remember your own. Did you know that researchers are finding that children who experience awe are more likely to have a sense of purpose and direction in their lives? They have a healthier response to life and are more likely to be successful. Seeing how immense our world is and our place within it gives us a perspective that can change our lives. It may really be true that life is not measured by the number of breaths we take, but by the moments when our breath is taken away. I'm convinced those are the moments when God is trying to get our attention. That's what happens when Moses hears God speaking out of the burning bush. That's what happens to the people of Israel when they stand at the foot of Mount Sinai and they hear the thunder of God's voice. That's what happens to Samuel when he hears that voice in the night calling his name. That's what happens to the disciples on the top of the mountain in our text for today. A fancy word for those experiences is theophany. It's a Greek word that means that God's voice can be heard. I'm convinced theophanies are times when God is trying to get our attention. In Celtic spirituality, they refer to those moments as thin spots. That's when the distance between heaven and earth becomes thin. The veil becomes so thin that we can begin to see more clearly God on the other side. I guess I'm not convinced that God is any closer in those times. I'm convinced we're more aware of God's presence. Diana Butler Bass tells the story of going to a retreat center in Southern California. It's a place she'd been to before, but a fire had happened and they wound up moving the retreat center. It used to be that it was on the top of a bluff overlooking a town and the ocean off into the distance. Now the retreat center's in that town. And from that retreat center, you can see up to the mountain or the bluff where they used to be. And she remembered the awe-inspiring views from that peak. But then she was also aware that there were just as many awe-inspiring things in the town. She could hear it in the busy streets and the sounds of children playing. As she described it, I was aware that awe is not something that happens by a place. It's our awareness of God's presence that evokes awe. The disciples are in awe on the mountaintop. The key to living out their faith, however, is to experience awe in the valley. And maybe that's why Jesus tells them not to tell anybody about this until later. You see, it's tempting to say God can only be found in the mountaintops, whether that's a physical place or a spiritual event like Caravan or when Stan Kenton Brass plays in worship. It happens when we see God in a retreat center or walking a labyrinth. But to limit our understanding of where God can be found, as if mountaintops are the only places where God's voice can be heard, is to miss out on the numerous times when there's a theophany taking place in the mundane and ordinary events of our lives. I am convinced that God is at work in your kitchens and in the hallways at school. I am convinced that God can be found on the city streets as well as within the walls of West Heights United Methodist Church. God's voice can be heard anytime we read the scripture, whether that's here in worship or in our quiet place at home, doing our daily devotions. There is no question in my mind that God can be found in the pews where you are sitting this morning, and God can be found in the Sunday school classrooms and at the table anytime we gather to eat. This place is filled with the holy presence of God. But this isn't just a place to call home in the Westlink neighborhood. It's also a place where God is trying to get our attention. Our task then is to become aware of God's presence. One way we do that is by participating in what John Wesley called means of grace. These are activities and practices that we do in order to experience God's presence because God has shown up in those events before. He includes things in that like corporate worship and prayer and devotion. It includes spiritual practices like visiting the sick and feeding the homeless. It also includes working for social justice and welcoming the stranger. With the season of Lent beginning on Wednesday of this week, some of us will become more intentional about our spiritual practices over the next few weeks. We will fast, or we will refrain from some activities, and we will add activities into our daily routines. My hope is that by doing so, we will become more aware of God's presence and more attuned to God's voice, that that we will have a sense of awe throughout the season of Lent. See, I believe God can use our Lenten disciplines to get our attention. Our calling as a congregation is to help others see and experience how awesome it is to know that God is here. And at the same time, to see and to know that God is concerned about how we are living our daily lives. The Transfiguration story is an invitation to experience the awesomeness of God's love and to find ways to share that with our world. Thanks be to God.